Imagine a tranquil landscape in the 14th century. A small village lies nestled among rolling hills, fields, and forests. The sun sets slowly, its light painting the rooftops golden, and a gentle breeze carries the scent of freshly harvested grain across the meadows. Everything seems peaceful, familiar, like a picture that has barely changed for generations. The people know their rituals, their work, their festivals. They rise with the rhythm of nature and go to bed with the sunlight. Life seems safe, reliable, predictable. But while peace and familiarity reign in these moments, no one suspects that a shadow will soon fall upon this world. A shadow that is invisible, silent, unstoppable. A shadow that will change, indeed destroy, the lives of millions. The Plague, the Black Death. A name that still evokes awe and goosebumps. But back then, in 1348, people didn't know what was coming. They knew nothing of bacteria, pathogens, or scientific explanations. They only sensed that something foreign, something threatening, was approaching. And no one knew how to escape it. Imagine you are one of those villagers. You go out one last time in the evening, gazing at the clear, starry sky. The stars shine brighter than we know them today, without the city lights that usually overwhelm the heavens. You take a deep breath, smelling the smoke from the chimneys, the hay stacked in the yard, the damp wood by the well. You feel the familiar world around you. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a barely perceptible sense of unease. The plague was a threat that didn't strike suddenly like a storm. It came creeping, invisible, like a fog that slowly settled through the streets. At first, there were only rumors. Tales of distant cities where people were dying suddenly. Of merchant ships that brought disease, just as they brought spices, fabrics, and stories. At first, people thought they were just stories, exaggerated, distant, unreal. But the rumors intensified. The stories became warnings. And finally, the invisible threat knocked on the gates of Europe, on the gates of villages and towns. For people in the Middle Ages, this was incomprehensible. They lived in a world where almost everything was explained through faith. Natural disasters were punishments or trials from God. Crop failures were interpreted as signs that people had sinned. And now came a disease that spread without anyone being able to understand it. Was it the wrath of God? Was it witchcraft? Or perhaps an invisible, evil force sweeping across the world? Fear grew even before the disease itself reached people. Sometimes the idea of a threat is more powerful than the threat itself. And so, stories of the plague spread faster than the disease. Let's immerse ourselves in this time together. Let's see the world through the eyes of the people who lived in 1348. People who tilled their fields, raised their children, celebrated their festivals, and were suddenly swept up in a catastrophe they couldn't comprehend. On this journey, we will travel through 7 stages. We begin with the origin of the plague, far from Europe. We will see how it made its way, how it reached villages and towns. We will experience what life was like before the catastrophe, and how everything changed when the disease arrived. We will hear how people reacted, with faith, with superstition, with fear, but also with hope. And we will understand the traces the plague left behind, traces that changed Europe forever. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment of quiet. Lean back, take a deep breath. Imagine yourself standing in a 14th century village. You hear the ringing of bells, the shouts of people, the distant bark of a dog. You feel the wind on your skin, the creaking of the wooden door as someone opens it. Everything is still familiar, peaceful, warm. And yet, somewhere in the background, barely perceptible, the shadow is already gathering. The story of the Black Death doesn't begin with a loud bang. It begins with a soft whisper, with rumors, with a premonition, with an invisible threat that will change the medieval world. If we want to understand the plague, we must trace its path back to where it all began. Not in Europe, not in the narrow streets of cities, or in the villages nestled between fields and forests, but far away, in a world that most people in the Middle Ages knew only through stories. The origins of the Black Death likely lie in Central Asia. Vast steppes, endless horizons, caravans that appeared like tiny dots at the edge of the sky. Here lived nomads, traders, and travelers. And here, so chronicles and accounts tell us, the disease first appeared. A disease transmitted by fleas to rats, small, inconspicuous animals that no one noticed, but which carried the seeds of a catastrophe within them. Along the Silk Road, that mighty trade route connecting China with Europe, the disease began its journey. The Silk Road was not just a route for fabrics, spices, and metals. It was also a conduit for ideas, stories, and diseases. Thus, the plague traveled, invisible and undetected, from place to place. Sometimes in the merchant's luggage, sometimes in the fur of animals, sometimes hidden in the ships heading for ports. Imagine you are a merchant of that time. You are traveling with your caravan through the desert. The sun beats down, the sand crunches under the wheels of your wagons, and the bells of your animals ring out in the distance. You bring silk, pepper, cinnamon, stories from faraway lands. But without knowing it, you are also carrying something else. An invisible enemy, hiding among the sacks, the crates, the animals. When the plague reached the Black Sea, it became a threat to all of Europe. The siege of the city of Kaffa in 1346 is particularly well known. A port city in Crimea, a Genoese trading center. The city was besieged by the Mongols, and the chronicles report that the plague broke out among the besiegers. It is said that the Mongols catapulted the bodies of the dead over the city walls. Whether this story is true in every detail, we don't know, but it shows how closely war, trade, and disease were intertwined. Ships sailed from Kaffa to Italy, and with them came the disease. Ports like Genoa, Venice, and Pisa became gateways through which the plague entered Europe. The ships carried not only goods and sailors, but also rats, fleas, and the invisible germ of the Black Death. Imagine a ship arriving in Venice. The sails are flapping in the wind, the sailors tired, exhausted from the long journey. They bring goods that the merchants eagerly await: spices, fabrics, precious stones. But while the cargo was being unloaded, rats scurried off the ship in secret, hiding in the city's warehouses. No one noticed them. No one suspected that they were carriers of a disease that would soon empty entire streets. From the ports, the plague spread like wildfire. Italian cities were densely populated, full of life, full of trade. It was precisely here, where people crowded together, that the disease could spread rapidly. From Italy, it moved on, to France, to Spain, to England, to Germany. Always following the trade routes, the roads, the rivers, the caravans. For the people, it was incomprehensible. They only saw that the disease was coming, and it was coming from outside. From distant lands, from unknown cities, with foreign merchants and ships. Thus, mistrust and fear arose. People began to avoid strangers, to suspect travelers. For somewhere, the origin of this horror had to lie. The speed of its spread was astonishing. Within just a few years, the plague reached almost every corner of Europe. From 1347 to 1352, it spread faster than anyone could explain at the time. Today, we know that it was the trade routes that enabled this pace. But for the people of that era, it was as if an invisible hand carried death from city to city. And so, at the beginning of the Black Death's story, stands a connection that was supposed to bring prosperity and wealth. Trade. The routes that brought spices and silk also brought disease. The ships that brought prosperity to Europe also carried the seeds of its downfall. It's a paradox that still haunts us today. Connections that bring prosperity can also carry danger. Back then, it was the plague that came through the ports and roads. Today, other threats are spreading across the world. But in the 14th century, people only saw the immediate danger, a danger that came from afar, drew inexorably closer, and would soon reach every village, every town, every house. Before the plague changed people's lives, there was a daily routine firmly rooted in the seasons, in the familiar rhythms of nature. The village was the world for most people, a place where they were born, lived, and died, often without ever having to travel far. Imagine a small medieval village. A few dozen houses built of wood with thatched roofs. A narrow path winding through the fields. In the center, perhaps a church, small, but for the people the heart of village life. Beside it, a well where women fetched water and exchanged news. In the morning, you could hear the rooster crowing. The day began early, often with the rising sun. People got up, dressed in simple linen, perhaps drank some weak beer or ate a piece of bread. Then work began. The men went to the fields, hitched up the plow, and led the oxen across the land. The creaking of the wood, the snorting of the animals, the rhythmic clatter of their hooves. All of this filled the air. The women took care of the house and farm. They ground grain, kneaded dough, and baked bread, the aroma of which wafted through the village. They mended clothes, looked after the children, and gathered herbs at the edge of the woods. Some also helped in the fields when the work was particularly hard. The children, in turn, were part of this daily life. From an early age, they took on small tasks, collecting wood, carrying water, and tending the animals. And yet, they still had time to play. They ran across the meadows, played with wooden hoops, laughing and shouting until their voices faded into the distance. The village was a vibrant place. The sound of the blacksmith's hammer, the clang of the loom, the calls of merchants hawking their wares filled the air. It was a tapestry of life's sounds, repeated day after day. And it was precisely this repetition that gave people a sense of security. The weeks were filled with rituals. Sunday was dedicated to worship. People gathered in the small church, listened to the priest, sang hymns, and offered prayers. It was a moment of community, of hope, of grounding in a world that was often unpredictable. The festivals of the year, Easter, Thanksgiving, Christmas, provided additional structure. They celebrated with songs, with dancing, with shared meals. In these moments lay joy, even when life was otherwise full of hardship. Of course, life wasn't easy. The work was hard, the weather unpredictable, the harvests uncertain. But people knew no other way. They lived in rhythm with nature, embracing joy and sorrow alike. A good year with a bountiful harvest brought hope. A bad year with crop failures brought worry. But even then, neighbors helped each other, sharing what they had. Imagine walking through such a village. You see children playing by the well while women wash clothes in the river. You hear laughter, the splashing of water, the fluttering of chickens. Smoke rises from a house. The air smells of soup, bread, everyday life. In the distance, men work in the fields, their voices carried on the wind. It's a picture of familiarity, of constancy, of life. The evenings were quieter. When the sun set, the family gathered in the house. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting light and shadow on the walls. They ate together, told stories, perhaps sang a song. The children went to bed early, while the adults spun, sewed, or talked for a while longer. Darkness fell quickly, and with it, silence. Only the wind, the creaking of the wood, and the distant howl of a dog accompanied the night. Before the plague, life was simple, sometimes hard, but sustained by a deep sense of stability. People knew what to expect the next day. They knew the work, the celebrations, the worries, the joys. And it was precisely this sense of security that made the coming catastrophe so devastating. For the plague broke into a world that was familiar, orderly, stable. It shattered this rhythm, tearing people from their routine. But as long as it remained distant, as long as it was only a rumor, people continued to live their accustomed lives. A life full of hope, full of small joys, full of familiar sounds and smells. And when we look at this village life today, we can almost hear it, almost smell it. The crackling of the fire, the children's laughter, the smell of fresh bread. It's a reminder that life itself, in its simplicity, was rich in moments that offered warmth and comfort. The plague didn't arrive with a bang. It came quietly, almost invisibly, and yet it changed the lives of millions. At first, it was just a suspicion, a rumor, a distant story. But then, one day, it stood right in the middle of the village, right in the middle of the city. Imagine you wake up one morning. The sun rises as usual. The roosters crow. The village awakens. But something is different. A neighbor is missing from the field. A woman lies sick in her hut. At first you think it's just a simple cold, a fever. But the fever rises, the weakness grows, and suddenly everyday life is disrupted. The plague manifested itself in different ways. Today we know that there were different forms: bubonic plague, pneumonic plague, and septicemia. For the people back then, it was simply a disease that seemed unstoppable. They saw fever, they saw weakness, they saw dark lumps growing on the body, but they didn't understand why. The lumps, swollen nodules, often under the armpits or in the groin, were the most visible sign for many. They were painful, hot, an outward symbol of the invisible threat. But people couldn't make sense of it. Was it poison in the air? Was it a curse? Or a punishment from God? The fever brought chills, heat, weakness. Some coughed, some bled. The illness came quickly, sometimes in just a few days. And death came just as quickly. For the village community, this was incomprehensible. Just yesterday they had worked together, laughed, shared bread. Today one was gone, and no one knew who would be next. The fear grew with each case. Fear is a feeling that can be stronger than any illness. It crept into houses, into hearts, into conversations. People whispered in the market, avoided their neighbors, and withdrew into themselves. People didn't know how to protect themselves. They lit candles, burned herbs, and held fragrant flowers to their faces, hoping that the bad breath, as it was called, would be driven away. Imagine walking through a city. The streets, usually full of merchants and children, have become quieter. Shutters remain closed, doors locked. Here and there you hear weeping. There the murmur of a prayer. The sound of bells announcing the dead grows more frequent, almost daily. A dull peal that lies like a heavy shadow over the alleys. Yet there were also attempts to hold on to hope. Mothers held their children tightly, singing soft songs to soothe them. Priests went from house to house, offering prayers and comfort. Neighbors brought each other bread or water, even though the fear of infection was great. It was a balancing act between closeness and distance, between helping and self-protection. The disease was not just a medical phenomenon. It was an emotional upheaval. It tore apart familiar structures, destroyed trust in what had previously seemed secure. And the more people fell ill, the greater the uncertainty grew. It was especially confusing for children. They didn't understand why their parents were sad, why neighbors were disappearing. For them, it was as if an invisible hand was changing their world, piece by piece. And yet, in the children's eyes, a spark of innocence often remained, a moment of laughter, even amidst the fear. The plague was therefore not just a physical illness. It was also a mirror of the soul. It showed how vulnerable the community was, and how strong at the same time. For despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, people tried to carry on. They went to the fields, they baked bread, they rang the bells. They clung to their daily routines as best they could. Perhaps this very clinging was a silent resistance, an attempt to preserve normality, even as everything around them crumbled. And in this attempt lay a kind of hope. For as long as the fire burned in the hearth, as long as children played, as long as prayers were said, there was a sense of life, stronger than the disease itself. And so the plague spread from village to village, from town to town. With it grew fear, but also the will to carry on. People suffered, they feared, they grieved, but they did not give up. The plague brought not only disease and death, but also a wave of questions, doubts, and uncertainty. People in the 14th century had no medical explanations. They searched for answers and found them in their faith, in ancient beliefs, in rituals that gave them support. Imagine a small village church. The bells ring, dull, slow, heavy. Inside, people kneel close together. Candles flicker, their light casting shadows on the walls. The air smells of smoke, of wax, of the fear of those gathered. A priest raises his hands, says prayers, asks for mercy, for protection, for healing. The voices of the faithful mingle, sometimes soft, sometimes loud, sometimes barely audible like a whisper. In this sound lies despair, but also hope. Many people saw the plague as God's punishment. They had sinned, they had strayed from the right path, and now illness came as a warning. So processions wound their way through the streets, men and women, barefoot, some with whips in their hands, beat themselves as penance. They hoped that their suffering would lessen the suffering of the community. The streets echoed with songs, prayers, and the rhythmic lash of whips against bare skin. It was a scene of profound despair, but also of burning faith. Yet not all reactions were driven by faith. Some sought other explanations. Superstition was widespread. People believed the stars were misaligned, that heaven had sent a sign. Others thought that poisonous fumes, so-called miasmas, had risen from the earth. To protect themselves, people carried fragrant pouches filled with herbs, roses, lavender, or rosemary. They held them over their mouths and noses, hoping to ward off the evil breath. In many cities, people went even further. They lit large fires in the squares, threw herbs into them, and let the smoke drift through the streets. The smell of burning wood and herbs hung heavy in the air, like an invisible wall against the disease. Whether it helped, they didn't know. But it gave them the feeling of doing something, of not being completely helpless. Some looked for someone to blame. It was easier to name an enemy than to bear the unseen. Thus, suspicions and accusations arose. Jews were accused of poisoning wells. Strangers, outsiders, the poor, all became targets of fear. It is a dark side of this time. The plague brought not only suffering, but also mistrust, hatred, and violence. Yet alongside despair, there were also moments of closeness. Neighbors helped each other, bringing food when a family could no longer cook. Mothers held their children close, told stories, sang songs to soothe their fear. Priests, despite the danger, went to the sick, held their hands, and offered comfort. It was a quiet courage, unassuming, yet profound. Imagine yourself sitting in a house from that time. The fire crackles, it's dark outside, and in the silence, you hear the distant ringing of a bell. The family sits together, quietly, almost silently. The mother says a prayer, the father murmurs a psalm. In this simple act lies comfort, a feeling that you are not alone, that a higher power is watching over you, even if you don't understand it. The children asked questions. Why is the neighbor getting sick? Why did Auntie die? The answers were simple, sometimes awkward, but always driven by the attempt to offer peace. God called them. The stars were unfavorable. It's a shadow that will soon pass. The plague brought fear, but it also brought community. It revealed the fragility of humankind, and at the same time, their capacity to seek hope, even in the deepest darkness. And when we look back today, we realize these reactions were human. They were not only an expression of ignorance, but also of the profound need to make the incomprehensible tangible. People sought words, rituals, gestures, and found a spark of comfort in them. The plague was not just a disease that claimed millions of lives. It was also a turning point, a rupture in the history of Europe. When a community is shaken so profoundly, more than just daily life changes. Society itself changes, the social order, people's way of thinking. Imagine Europe in 1350. Wide fields, cities that thrived on trade, monasteries filled with prayer. But now many houses are empty. Streets seem quieter. Villages are half abandoned. The bells ring more frequently, but often there is no one left to hear them. The plague didn't just take lives, it destabilized the balance of society. A central problem was work. So many farmers had died that the fields lay fallow. Vineyards became overgrown, grain rotted in the fields. The few who survived had to work harder, but they also possessed a new kind of power. Work was scarce. Hands were valuable. For the first time in centuries, peasants could demand better conditions. Some moved on, seeking new farms that readily accepted them. The structures of serfdom began to loosen. Much was changing in the cities as well. Craftsmen were missing. Merchants had died, markets shrank. Prices fluctuated, sometimes rising, sometimes falling. It was a time of uncertainty, and yet also a time of new opportunities. A young man could now take over a workshop that would otherwise have been unattainable. A woman could continue running a shop because there was no one else. Gaps became visible, and people filled them in new ways. The church, which had been the undisputed authority for so long, lost some of its prestige. Many had prayed, done penance, held processions, and yet no salvation came. Priests died just as farmers did. Bishops just as children did. This shook faith. Some people turned away from the faith, seeking new paths. Others clung to it even more tightly, but with a quiet doubt in their hearts. Thus began a process that would change Europe over the centuries, toward more questions, more criticism, more searching for answers outside of faith. Art, too, changed. Before the plague, images were often characterized by joy, by life, by religious confidence. But after the plague, new motifs emerged. Dances of death, skeletons, images of transience. Death had become omnipresent, and art reflected this. Frescoes depicted not only saints, but also death, claiming rich and poor alike. It was a new honesty, a reminder that life was fragile. And yet the plague did not only bring fear, it also brought a quiet form of freedom. Because so many people had died, new opportunities arose for the survivors. Farmers could become independent tenants. Craftsmen could advance their careers. In some regions, women had more responsibility because they continued to run family businesses. It was as if the plague shook the old structures and left cracks through which new life grew. Imagine walking through a city a few years after the Great Wave. Some houses are empty, windows boarded up. Yet nearby, you can hear the hammering of a blacksmith, the laughter of children, the shouts of a merchant. The city is alive, albeit differently. It's a mixture of grief and new beginnings, of loss and rebirth. The memory of the plague also changed people's mentality. Many people felt how fragile life was. This fostered a new way of thinking. If life could be so short, then it should be enjoyed. Festivals became more exuberant, songs louder, wine glasses fuller. A spark of joie de vivre mingled with the grief, a balance between memento mori, the remembrance of death, and carpe diem, the call to seize the day. The plague, therefore, had two faces. One was dark, suffering, death, despair. The other was brighter, change, opportunities, new paths. After 1350, Europe was no longer the same. The old structures had developed cracks that gave rise to new ideas. In these cracks, a different world slowly grew, a world that would lead to the Renaissance centuries later. When we look back today, we see not only the catastrophe, we also see the strength of people to adapt, to begin anew. In the midst of the shadow, they found sparks of light. And that is precisely what makes the story of the plague so powerful. It shows us how deeply suffering and new beginnings can be intertwined. The sun has set. The fields lie still. The streets are empty. And night falls over the villages and towns. In the 14th century, the darkness was deeper than we know it. No electric light illuminated the houses. Only candles and torches cast their warm, flickering glow. The world seemed quieter, slower, and in this stillness, after the long days of fear, people found moments of peace. Imagine a small house during this time. The family sits together around the fire. The wood crackles, the smoke drifts slowly through the cracks in the roof. The children have eaten. They lie on straw mats, wrapped in rough blankets. The mother tells a story, softly, almost like a song. The father murmurs a prayer, asking for protection for the night. And outside, the crickets sing as the sky fills with stars. Even though the plague dominated the day, bringing fear and uncertainty, people sought solace at night. They didn't know if the next morning would be safe, yet they clung to rituals that offered comfort. A sign of the cross, a song, a prayer, small gestures that helped make the darkness more bearable. The darkness was not only a threat, it was also protection. It settled over the world like a cloak, concealing worries for a moment. By candlelight, people told each other stories, not only of saints and martyrs, but also fairy tales, legends, and myths. They spoke of dragons, of brave knights, of faraway lands. These stories were like a counterweight to reality. They gave children dreams, adults hope. And so, even in the midst of the greatest catastrophe, life found ways to go on. The plague had destroyed much, but it could not stop people from laughing, children from playing, couples from falling in love, or new songs from being born. Life always returned, just as the sun returns after every night. Imagine the silence after a long day. You lie on your bed, listening to your family breathing around you. Outside, the wind rustles through the trees. Somewhere a nightbird calls. The darkness is complete, yet it doesn't feel threatening. It's gentle, like a blanket enveloping you. In this silence, you feel the fragility of life, and at the same time, its strength. The plague was a night for Europe, a long, heavy night. But it too passed. New life grew from the darkness. Cities recovered. Fields were cultivated again. Bells rang out for celebration once more. The memory remained, but people found new paths. They were marked by loss, yet at the same time richer in experience, in knowledge. Today, centuries later, we look back on this time. We see the fear, the death, the grief, but also the hope that never truly died. We recognize that in every darkness, a light is hidden, and that even after the most difficult times, a new dawn will dawn. Perhaps we can take something from this story for ourselves. We too know uncertainty. We too experience crises. But just as people in the Middle Ages endured their nights, so too can we find trust. In the rhythm of everyday life, in small gestures, in the belief in a new day. And as you hear these words, as the images of the Middle Ages slowly fade, your own day, too, may come to an end. The sounds of the present recede. The darkness around you deepens, becomes calmer. Take another deep breath. Feel the peace spreading. Just as back then, when people found peace despite all their fears, you too can let go now. For the night is not only an end, it is also a beginning for dreams, for recovery, for hope. And just as Europe found a new dawn after the plague, you too will see a new light after this night. Sleep peacefully, and remember, new life always grows out of darkness.